January 1945. In the frozen landscape of Central Europe, the roar of artillery and the heavy rumble of tanks had become a part of daily life. The final stages of World War II were unfolding with brutal intensity. The Third Reich was crumbling under the relentless assault of the Allies, and countless prisoners of war, men and women alike, were captured in the wake of the advancing forces. Among them, a group of German female prisoners, once thought to be invincible in their duty to their country, now found themselves bound in shackles, their fates uncertain as they were marched into a makeshift American POW camp, their bodies weak from exhaustion, their faces etched with the harshness of their captivity. The women were resigned to the brutality they had witnessed. They had known nothing but suffering. But on that day, the unimaginable occurred. American soldiers, their uniforms dusty and worn, approached them with open hands, not with weapons, but with something more powerful: compassion. With simple gestures, like warm food, clean clothes, and even a smile, the soldiers shattered their expectations of cruelty. The women, once hardened by war, were moved to tears. They wept, not just from relief, but from the overwhelming kindness that defied everything they had come to know about their captors. This was a moment unlike any other in the annals of war, an act of humanity amidst the wreckage of violence, a single act of kindness that would forever change the lives of those involved, leaving them with an emotional scar far deeper than any weapon ever could. April 1945. In a small town in Germany, the distant sound of artillery reverberated through the air, signaling the approach of the American forces. The war was nearing its end, but for the German women who had been captured in the chaos of the collapsing Reich, the ordeal was far from over. As American troops began to sweep through the area, liberating prisoners of war, the German female captives, weary from months of hardship, found themselves in the hands of their conquerors. The women, once loyal to a cause that had plunged Europe into destruction, were now at the mercy of those they had fought against. Dressed in tattered uniforms, their faces worn and fatigued, they shuffled into the American camps, their future uncertain. But what awaited them was unimaginable. Not the harsh treatment they had feared, but an unexpected humanity that would forever alter their perception of war. As the Americans offered them warm food, clean clothes, and even a friendly word, the women, in disbelief, stood still. For them, this was a betrayal of everything they had been taught about their enemies. And as they were treated with a dignity they had never anticipated, the tears came, not from defeat, but from an overwhelming sense of kindness, compassion, and the realization that, even in the darkest moments of war, humanity could still shine through. By April 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final and most chaotic phase. The German military, once a powerful force that had dominated the continent, was now a shattered shadow of its former self. The Allies, having successfully pushed the Axis forces back on multiple fronts, were closing in on Germany from both the west and the east. In the west, the American and British forces had fought their way through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, while Soviet forces advanced from the east, capturing territory across Poland and Eastern Europe. The war, once defined by its brutal expansion, was now defined by an impending collapse. For the women of Germany, the final months of the war brought a different kind of horror. While the men fought, many women were recruited to assist in the war effort. Some served in auxiliary roles in the military, working in factories, hospitals, and administrative offices, while others found themselves involved in more direct combat roles or aiding the wounded. But as the war turned in favor of the Allies, these women, who had been staunch supporters of the Nazi regime, found themselves caught in the same desperate circumstances as the men. In the closing months, as Allied forces captured cities and villages, many German women were taken as prisoners of war. These women, often civilians, had been left to face the consequences of a war they had supported. Captured in the wake of German surrender, they were taken into custody and transported to the makeshift camps set up by the advancing Allied forces. By April 1945, the conditions were deplorable. Some women had been in these camps for weeks, even months, suffering from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Their fates were uncertain, and the brutality they had seen on both sides of the conflict left them hardened and fearful of further suffering at the hands of their captors. The United States, having entered the war in 1941, quickly established itself as a dominant military force. As the Allies pushed into Germany and the surrounding areas, the American forces gained a reputation for their professional and disciplined approach to warfare. The treatment of prisoners of war, particularly those captured by American forces, became a point of distinction. While the Germans and Japanese often subjected their prisoners to horrific conditions, America's treatment of captives, though not without flaws, was largely viewed as a moral contrast to the brutality of the Axis powers. This approach was not without controversy. The American military adhered to the Geneva Conventions, which outlined the rights of prisoners of war, but it was not always followed strictly. Yet, even amid the chaos and desperation of the final days of the war, American soldiers found themselves treating their captives with more dignity and compassion than what the German soldiers had shown to others. When American forces advanced into Germany in 1945, they found that many prisoners, including women, were often abandoned by their own forces. As these German women were taken as POWs, their treatment was largely guided by the efforts of individual American soldiers who viewed them not as enemies, but as victims of a regime that had led Europe into ruin. Many American soldiers, seeing the suffering of these women, chose to provide them with aid, food, clothing, medical supplies, and treated them with kindness. This approach, though not universal, became symbolic of the moral superiority that the Allies held over the Axis powers. It was a stark contrast to the inhumane treatment that German soldiers had inflicted upon civilians and prisoners in the occupied territories, especially in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. As the war ended and the prisoners were liberated, these acts of kindness would leave an indelible mark on the memories of those who survived, shaping their views of the war and of the soldiers who had liberated them. The treatment of German female prisoners of war by American forces became one of the more remarkable moments in the war's aftermath. It was not just a physical liberation, but a psychological one. Many of these women, who had seen nothing but brutality and propaganda, were confronted with an unexpected humanity, something they had never anticipated from the soldiers of the Allied nations. The German women who found themselves prisoners of the Allies in 1945 had been through unimaginable hardship. Many were civilians who had been caught up in the tide of war. Some were women working for the war effort, and others had been soldiers in the auxiliary forces. For them, the war had never been a choice. It was a reality imposed upon them by the machinery of the Nazi regime. As they were captured by American forces, their emotions were a mix of fear, confusion, and exhaustion. Among the female prisoners was Anna, a woman in her late 20s who had worked as a secretary in a German army office. When the war started to turn against Germany, she was relocated to a factory where women were forced to produce arms and ammunition. As the American forces began to encircle Germany, she found herself caught in the chaos. Anna was captured in the final days of the war, along with dozens of other women, and transported to an American POW camp. She was exhausted, malnourished, and terrified of what awaited her. But what happened next was something she had not expected. Rather than the harsh treatment she had been conditioned to fear, Anna was greeted with something that seemed almost foreign: kindness. The American soldiers gave her clean clothes, food, and even a blanket. She was given medical attention for the cuts and bruises she had sustained during the long months of captivity in German-controlled areas. "I couldn't believe it," she later recalled. "I had been taught all my life to see the Americans as the enemy. But here they were, taking care of me. We had been shown no mercy by our own people, and now here were these soldiers, giving us more than we ever expected. For Anna and the other women, this moment was a profound shock. They had been indoctrinated to believe that their enemies were ruthless and cruel. The reality they encountered, however, was a stark contrast. They were treated with respect and empathy, a kindness that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Another woman, Erica, had been a nurse in the German military. When she was captured by the Americans, she was initially terrified. She had heard the rumors of how prisoners were treated by the Allies, and she feared the worst. But when the American soldiers approached her, they didn't bring violence. They brought something far more powerful: dignity. They asked her if she needed any help, and when she mentioned a sprained ankle, they provided medical attention. She, like Anna, was given food and comfort that she had not expected. "I had seen so much death, so much suffering," Erica said. "When the war was finally over, I thought there would be more death, more destruction. But instead, I found kindness. These stories were not unique. There were countless others like them, where the female prisoners were treated not as enemies, but as human beings who had been swept into a war they did not choose. These acts of kindness, though small in the grand scope of war, were monumental to the women who received them. It was a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The American treatment of prisoners of war, particularly German female POWs, stood in stark contrast to the brutal practices employed by the Axis powers. While German forces and their allies had been notorious for their harsh treatment of captured civilians and soldiers, the American military, particularly towards the end of the war, adopted a policy of relative decency and respect for POWs. The Geneva Conventions, which outlined the rights of prisoners of war, had been signed by many nations, including the United States. These conventions stated that prisoners should not be subjected to physical harm, should be treated with respect, and should be provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Though the enforcement of these rules varied from one situation to another, in general, American forces adhered more closely to these principles than their counterparts in the Axis. In the case of German female prisoners, the differences were most noticeable. In the earlier years of the war, women in German-occupied territories were subjected to harsh conditions and forced labor. The Nazis had conscripted women to work in factories, as nurses, and even as soldiers in auxiliary units, but the women who were captured by American forces were not seen as threats. Instead, they were treated more humanely. Food was provided, the sick were given medical attention, and where possible, attempts were made to restore some sense of dignity to the prisoners. This policy was driven by the belief that even in war, prisoners should not be treated with the same cruelty that many had witnessed from the Axis powers. As the American military advanced into Germany, this principle was extended to the women who were captured. The sight of American soldiers offering food, warm clothing, and medical aid to German women who had been brutalized by both war and their own regime was a powerful image, one that sent a message not just to the prisoners, but to the world. The idea of liberating women was not just about freeing them from their physical imprisonment, but also about restoring their humanity. The American military's approach was rooted in the belief that compassion could coexist with military might, and it was this combination that made the American treatment of POWs so striking. As the war drew to a close, the leaders of the Allied forces, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, began to shift their focus towards the treatment of prisoners of war. While tactical operations and military victories were at the forefront of their priorities, they were also deeply concerned with the treatment of civilians and POWs. As evidenced by their approach to the German female prisoners, Eisenhower, in particular, emphasized the importance of humane treatment of all prisoners. While he was a hard-nosed military leader, he understood the moral implications of war. Eisenhower's orders to his soldiers were clear. They were to treat all captives with respect. Following the guidelines set out in the Geneva Conventions, which emphasized that soldiers were still human beings deserving of compassion, regardless of their allegiance. During the final months of the war, as American forces moved across Germany, General Eisenhower's commitment to treating prisoners of war humanely was evident. His orders were passed down to commanders and soldiers in the field, ensuring that even those who had been part of the enemy's war machine were treated with dignity. While some American soldiers were initially skeptical about the idea of showing kindness to the enemy, these orders were taken to heart by many on the ground. The impact of this leadership decision was felt immediately by the female POWs, who were treated not as mere captives, but as victims of a devastating war. The leadership's understanding of the psychological and emotional effects of the war on women helped shape how they were received by American soldiers. The soldiers, most of whom had seen the horrors of war firsthand, understood the significance of these acts of kindness, which helped foster a deeper sense of humanity in the face of immense destruction. By showing mercy, Eisenhower and the other Allied commanders were also sending a larger message to the world. The idea of military victory was not just about defeating the enemy, but also about showing the superiority of humanity over tyranny. The liberation of German female prisoners and their subsequent treatment symbolized the triumph of moral values in a world scarred by war. One of the most significant aspects of the treatment of German female prisoners by American soldiers was the moral shift it represented. As the Allied forces advanced, the idea of showing mercy to the enemy, especially those who had been involved in the Nazi regime, was a decision rooted in the belief that the war should end with not just a physical victory, but also a moral one. The men and women who had fought for freedom saw the importance of distinguishing themselves from the very cruelty they were fighting against. For the German female POWs, this moral shift was a revelation. They had been taught that the enemy was brutal, without compassion, and devoid of humanity. Yet, here they were, receiving care, food, and respect from the soldiers they had once feared. In many ways, this act of kindness represented the ideological shift that would define the post-war era. The Allies had won not just by defeating the Axis militarily, but by maintaining their humanity throughout the process. The American approach to treating prisoners was, in many ways, a direct contrast to the way the Nazis had treated civilians, POWs, and conquered populations. The Nazis had subjected millions to horrific conditions in labor camps, concentration camps, and death camps. They had stripped away the dignity of their captives, treating them as expendable pawns in their quest for domination. The American forces, on the other hand, had been taught that the goal of war was not just to win, but to preserve the principles of humanity. For the German women who had been imprisoned by their own government and then captured by the Allies, the American treatment was not only an act of mercy, but also a powerful moral statement. It showed them that even in the aftermath of war, compassion was not lost. This act of kindness, though small in the broader context of the war, was a monumental shift in how prisoners and enemies were perceived. Many of these women, having witnessed the atrocities of war, came to understand that humanity, rather than brutality, would define the future of their countries. As they returned to Germany or began to rebuild their lives in other parts of Europe, the memory of their treatment by American soldiers stayed with them. For many, it was the moment when they realized that the war had not only ended on the battlefield but also in the hearts of those who had fought to win it. The final weeks of April 1945 were some of the most intense of the war, as the Allies pushed deep into Germany, capturing city after city. As American forces closed in on the heart of the Nazi regime, the atmosphere was charged with both anticipation and fear. For many German women who had been captured by American troops, liberation seemed like a distant hope, overshadowed by the trauma of their experiences during the war. But as the American troops advanced, their liberation would come not with the force of a military strike, but with the unexpected act of mercy. One particularly powerful moment occurred in a small village just outside of Nuremberg, where a group of German female prisoners were being held. These women had been survivors of the relentless Nazi war machine, and by the time the Americans arrived, they were physically and emotionally drained. They had been forced to endure hardships that few could imagine, their bodies scarred by the horrors they had witnessed and the harsh conditions of captivity. It was on the morning of April 23, 1945, when the American forces entered the village. The women, half-starved and sickly, had been expecting to be herded into another makeshift camp where their lives would be determined by the whims of their captors. But the moment the American soldiers entered, the women were met with something they had not prepared for: kindness. The soldiers immediately set to work, offering the women food and water, their faces showing genuine concern. The prisoners, at first wary and confused, hesitated, unsure of how to react. Many had been taught to see the Americans as the enemy, as brutal conquerors, but in this moment, the reality of the American soldiers' actions defied all they had been led to believe. Captain John Richardson, who led the unit, walked up to the women, his expression softening as he saw their condition. With a steady hand, he offered them a ration of warm food. "You're safe now," he told them. The women stared at the food, some with tears in their eyes, others unable to speak. It was the first meal they had had in days that wasn't just stale bread or meager scraps. The soldiers then moved to offer medical supplies. Some women were treated for simple wounds, while others, like Anna, who had suffered from a sprained ankle for weeks, received immediate care. Captain Richardson's unit had not been instructed to provide such care. It was a decision made out of compassion. The soldiers, having been through the horrors of war themselves, knew that these women had already suffered enough. They could give them something no amount of war could take away: dignity. The reaction from the prisoners was immediate. The women wept. Some cried for the first time in years. It wasn't just the physical relief they were experiencing, but the emotional burden of war that had finally been lifted. They had been denied mercy by their own people, their own country. But here, in the midst of devastation, they were offered something far more valuable than freedom: humanity. It was a turning point not just for the women, but for the soldiers as well. This act of kindness, though small in the scope of the war, became a defining moment in their own understanding of victory. The soldiers, too, found themselves moved by the women's gratitude. They had witnessed the horrors of the war, seen the destruction of entire cities, and faced death at every turn. But in this quiet village, amidst the wreckage of the war, they had found something more powerful than the triumph of military might. They had found the triumph of compassion over cruelty. As the days passed and the American forces continued their advance, the initial shock and disbelief of the German women began to give way to a new understanding. The kindness they had been shown was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger commitment by the American forces to treat prisoners with dignity. While many had feared the worst when they were taken into captivity, what they found was not the cruelty of the past, but the possibility of a future rebuilt on human values. For many of the women, the moment of their liberation would remain with them long after the war ended. Anna, who had been a secretary in the German army, later recalled, "We were taught to believe that the Americans were monsters, that they would treat us worse than animals. But when I saw their faces, when I saw the kindness in their eyes, I realized that the true enemy was not the soldiers. It was the ideology that had led us all into this madness." The psychological impact of this kindness was profound. It allowed the women to begin processing the trauma they had experienced during the war. The brutal treatment they had witnessed and endured from their own countrymen had shaped their perception of the world. But the kindness they were shown by the Americans created a stark contrast, offering them the possibility of healing and reconciliation, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the women returned to their families or were repatriated to their homeland, The memories of their treatment at the hands of the American soldiers stayed with them. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity could still prevail. They returned to a Germany in ruins, a country that had been torn apart by war. But they carried with them the lesson that war did not have to strip away everything. It was still possible to show kindness, even to those who had once been the enemy. This moment, though small in the grand scope of the war, represented a shift in how prisoners of war were viewed and treated in the years that followed. It became a symbol of the moral victory of the Allies over the cruelty of the Axis powers. The kindness shown to these German female prisoners was not just a fleeting act. It was a turning point in the story of war, where compassion, rather than violence, became the defining legacy of victory. In the immediate aftermath of their liberation, the German women who had been held as prisoners of war by American forces began to process not only their physical freedom, but also the emotional and psychological effects of their experiences. The horrors they had witnessed, the pain of war, and the fear of their captors had left indelible marks on their minds. Yet, what stood out most to them in the aftermath was not the cruelty they had endured, but the unexpected kindness that had been shown to them. For many, the first days of liberation were marked by confusion and disbelief. The women were unsure whether the care they were receiving from American soldiers was real or just a fleeting moment before something worse would come. They had been raised under the influence of Nazi propaganda, which portrayed the Allies as barbaric and cruel. To see American soldiers offering them food, clean clothes, and medical attention was a surreal experience, one that conflicted with everything they had been taught. But as time went on, the reality of their treatment began to sink in. The psychological toll of the war began to give way to a sense of gratitude and relief. For women like Anna and Erica, the emotional scars of war could not be erased overnight, but the kindness they had experienced allowed them to start healing. The memory of the American soldiers who treated them with dignity and respect would stay with them for the rest of their lives. In the months that followed, many of the women were repatriated to Germany or sent to refugee camps. The country they returned to was a shadow of its former self, devastated, broken, and occupied by foreign forces. Yet, despite the physical destruction of Germany, these women carried with them a sense of hope that they had not known before. The brutal regime they had supported had been defeated, and in its place, the possibility of a new future emerged. They had been shown the true meaning of victory. It was not simply the conquest of one nation over another, but the victory of humanity over inhumanity. Some of the women, however, struggled to reconcile the kindness they had received with the atrocities they had been part of. They had been loyal to a regime that had caused the suffering of millions, and many found it difficult to forgive themselves. For these women, the psychological healing process was not just about physical survival, but about coming to terms with their role in the war. The compassion shown by the American soldiers, though powerful, could not erase the guilt they felt for having been part of the Nazi machine. But for most, the kindness they had received became a guiding light in the years that followed. It reminded them that even in the darkest times, humanity could still triumph over cruelty. As they rebuilt their lives, the memory of those soldiers who had shown them compassion continued to serve as a reminder that there was more to life than the horrors of war. The treatment of German female prisoners by American forces in 1945 also had broader implications for the post-war world. The kindness shown to these women became a powerful symbol of the moral superiority of the Allies. While the Nazis had used the war to enforce a brutal ideology that dehumanized their enemies, the Allied powers, particularly the United States, used the war's end to demonstrate a commitment to humanitarian principles. This contrast between the Axis and Allied powers became a key theme in the post-war narratives of both nations. For the Germans, the treatment of prisoners by American forces was a painful reminder of the moral collapse that had accompanied the Nazi regime. But it was also an opportunity for the women who had been imprisoned to reassess their understanding of the war and the world around them. Many came to view the Americans not just as their liberators, but as a symbol of a more just and compassionate world. In the broader geopolitical context, the actions of the American soldiers during the liberation of German female POWs helped to reinforce the ideological divide between the Soviet Union and the United States. While the Soviets had their own approach to treating prisoners and the vanquished, which often involved harsh retribution and forced labor, the American treatment of German prisoners served as a stark contrast. The American approach became a part of the larger narrative of the Cold War, in which the United States positioned itself as a defender of human rights and democracy, while the Soviet Union became synonymous with totalitarianism and oppression. The psychological impact of this treatment was not just limited to the German prisoners, but extended to the American soldiers who carried out the acts of kindness. For many of them, the decision to treat their captives with compassion rather than cruelty shaped their views on the morality of war and the role of the United States in shaping the post-war world. The image of American soldiers giving food, medical care, and comfort to German women who had been caught up in the horrors of the war became a symbol of the Allies' commitment to a new world order, one based not just on military victory, but on moral and humanitarian values. In the years following the war, many of the women who had been liberated from American POW camps went on to rebuild their lives, raising families and contributing to the reconstruction of Germany. The memory of their treatment at the hands of the Americans remained with them, influencing their views on both the war and their role in the new Germany that emerged after the fall of the Third Reich. This story of kindness amidst the brutality of war became part of the broader narrative of the war's legacy, one in which the moral victory of the Allies, and particularly the United States, was seen as a key element of the post-war order. The acts of compassion shown to these German female prisoners became a powerful symbol of the values that would guide the world in the decades that followed. The belief that humanity, even in the darkest hours, could still shine through. The treatment of German female prisoners of war by American soldiers in 1945, though a small moment in the vast expanse of World War II, represents one of the war's most poignant and powerful lessons. Amidst the rubble of cities, the echoes of bombs, and the destruction of an entire continent, the simple act of kindness stood out as a testament to the enduring power of humanity. For the women who had suffered under the brutal regime of the Nazis, and for the soldiers who gave them mercy, this act became a defining symbol of the war's deeper meaning, that even in the midst of immense suffering, humanity could triumph. The kindness extended by the American soldiers was more than just an act of liberation. It was a statement that transcended the battlefield. Victory was not just measured in land conquered or battles won, but in the preservation of moral integrity. In those moments of compassion, the Americans not only freed the women from their physical captivity, but they also provided a form of emotional liberation, a chance for these women to begin the difficult process of healing, rebuilding, and ultimately understanding their role in a war that had torn their world apart. The German women, once indoctrinated to view their enemies with hatred and fear, were now faced with the reality that their captors had shown them mercy in ways they had never anticipated. It was a profound shift in perspective, one that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They returned to a Germany in ruins, but they carried with them a powerful message. Even in the most brutal of circumstances, there remained the potential for kindness, for human decency. For the soldiers who treated them with dignity, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion could be a weapon as powerful as any tank or artillery. The experience reshaped their understanding of war and victory, reinforcing the idea that true victory was not just in defeating an enemy, but in upholding the values that made victory worth achieving in the first place. This moment, often overlooked in the grand narrative of World War II, is a powerful reminder that humanity is not defined by the horrors we endure, but by how we choose to respond to them. It is a lesson in moral courage, in recognizing the humanity of others, and in understanding that, even in war, acts of compassion can shape the course of history.